Thistle and Verse, and today I'm going to be reviewing Sorrowland by River Solomon. I received an advanced reader's copy of this book in exchange for a fair and honest review. Thank you to the publishers for that. All opinions are my own. In terms of housekeeping items, Sorrowland is coming out on Tuesday, May 4th, and also the author River Solomon uses Fae Fair and they them pronouns. Of those pronouns, I think Fae prefer Fae Fair, so those are the ones I'm going to be using the most in this video. So, Sorrowland is a genre blender. Sorrowland has some elements of sci-fi to it, it has some horror elements to it, and it's about this black teen mother, Vern. Vern is intersex, she's also albino, and as a result, she has very low vision. And Vern is 7 months pregnant, and she's desperate to escape the strict religious community called Caneland where she was raised. Caneland is like a pseudo-Christian, pseudo-pro-black religious community that is very patriarchal, very misogynist, very queer antagonistic, and abuse is just kind of rampant in there, whether it is the religious leader or it is various parents who live in the community. And due to Vern's upbringing in this community, she's very distrustful of authority figures. And also because of her education in Caneland, she's very self-sufficient. She knows a lot of survival skills, and so she decides that she's going to go into the woods and just hide out there. And she gives birth to her twins, Howling and Feral, and she's trying to just stay out in the woods away from everyone and make a life for herself out there. But someone is hunting Vern and her family. Someone keeps leaving these dead animals dressed up as babies wherever Vern is. Vern's also experiencing these hauntings. She's seeing people who aren't there. She's talking to people that she knows are dead. And her body is undergoing strange changes. Her endurance has increased. She's a lot stronger. She's also getting weirdly achy. And she has strange growths on her back. And so Sorrowland is about Vern trying to raise her children to the best of her ability and figure out what is going on with her. Sorrowland starts off strong with its folkloric writing. It's very simple but poetic and very punchy. Almost every sentence in the first 3 or so chapters I wanted to highlight and quote. The moments of body horror are phenomenal. Vern's relationship with her body in general is just very fraught, but as it begins to change, the descriptions around that are great and terrifying in terms of the urges that she has, in terms of what has control over it. Aside from the really strong writing in the beginning, I think the story is also carried by its characters. Vern reminds me a lot of Aster from an Unkindness of Ghosts. She's very headstrong. She doesn't have a lot of time for social niceties, but I think Vern is also more fragile than Aster. Vern is a lot more insecure due to how she was raised in Caneland. She has a lot of hang-ups about her sexuality as a sapphic, about being intersex, being albino, and I think she's also really trying to figure out how to be a good mother. She was impregnated by the leader of Caneland when she was a teenager, so she's already doing this very monumental task when she's very young, and she's doing something that normally she would get a lot of help with all by herself in the woods. I think she has very complex feelings about being a mother. She really does love Howling and Feral, but she does also feel very conflicted about now that she's on the run, being a mother, and just how her insecurities from growing up in Caneland affect her ability to mother. She doesn't really have a whole lot of models for the parent that she wants to be. She just really wants to be very free of rules and labels. And I also liked the complexity that Solomon allowed Vern to have around the sexual abuse that she experiences. What stood out to me is that Vern has very complicated motives for why she navigates sexual situations the way that she does, and there are ways that the very conservative closed off community taught her to view her body and sex that prime her to go into these exploitative sexual situations. And I think it's also a factor of Vern not knowing that better is a possibility, or you feel you're taking control by initiating an encounter that isn't going to go well, but that just feels powerful for you in that moment. I also really liked Vern's kids, Howling and Feral. They have this like mix of confidence and freedom and like an adaptability to their circumstances that makes their worldview like really fresh and endearing. They're very mature in some ways, and they've had a very unconventional life, so I think they are like very confident in ways that I didn't really expect like 3 year olds to be. But there's something about them that also still seems very young in terms of like how new everything seems to them, in terms of their patience for certain things, in terms of like their need for validation. I think my favorite part of the story was when Vern's raising the kids in the woods. It's like something out of Hatchet. Like Vern's like gathering berries and like making her kids rabbit skin coats and all this like survival type stuff. And I really like the descriptions that we get of the scenery and Vern's relationship with her children and how she raises her children. Eventually, Vern, Howling, and Farrell do leave the forest, and when they do, they meet this Lakota woman named Gogo. Gogo and Vern have a very interesting relationship. There's a romantic and sexual tension there. Vern has been raised to be very ashamed of her body, and Gogo hasn't really been in a serious relationship, so she's kind of learning how to care for someone. They're both very proud people, so there will be missteps, and there's kind of like a standoff where they don't know who's going to apologize first as they're like learning to be together. There's also ways that Gogo relates to her body as someone who's Lakota that help Vern find a peace in her body. I think Gogo said that she's Winkty or Two Spirit, and that gives Vern like an alternate way to think about her body and her gender. So I really enjoyed like the relationship and how those two grew together. For people who like don't know about the history of medical experimentation on black people in the US and like counter like revolutionary efforts by the US government against black civil rights activists, this book does like name drop events and projects, so that could inspire readers to do some research. Editing Chloe here. I just wanted to say that it was also interesting however Solomon chose to deal with racist slurs, especially in light of conversations of how depicting anti-blackness impacts black readers. Basically, there's an incident where Vern is learning to read and she encounters the haunting of this like plantation owner who mocks her and does call her a racist slur. And the way River Solomon does it, Faye gives context for what the slur is and then focuses on the emotions that Vern feels about that and like focuses on like the context of the slur and like how it's been used historically, which sounds like a lot, but it was like a very concise sentence that was like very quotable. And I'm interested to see if like other black authors are gonna like take this up. I've kind of seen something similar done in Strange Fruit Volume 2, which is a nonfiction graphic novel by Joel Christian Gill. But the workaround he had was like very specific to comics and it still involved using anti black iconography, so I don't know if the end effect is going to be quite the same. I think up to this point, I've kind of seen black authors, like, it'll be like a big moment of like a slur or like anti blackness, and then there's like kind of like a break afterwards, and it's more like the plotting that does the softening. I haven't really seen the softening done in the description itself, and so I thought that was very interesting. In terms of things that didn't really work for me, River Solomon is like one of my favorite authors ever, so I came into this book with very high expectations, and there were places where I really wanted more from it. In terms of the writing, there's a poetry to the simplicity in the beginning, but around like the halfway mark, the poetry kind of left, and it just felt like I was being told things and like kind of shunted places in the plot as opposed to getting to experience the story. And I felt like I lost a lot of momentum and like emotional investment. Like Verma just kind of seemed to know things, and it wasn't really clear how she knew things. Like it wasn't from a haunting, it wasn't from any of the abilities that she develops during the story. It was also not really clear to me what her antagonist's abilities are, which I thought was important for establishing the stakes when they face off. Like it's implied that Vern's antagonists have some level of control over Vern's body, and that provides a lot of tension, that provides some great moments of body horror, but also it seemed like their pursuit of her was kind of roundabout. And if they had like so much control over her, why were they going through all these side roads to like catch her? Also, I felt kind of detached from the villains, and I don't know why. The villains in An Unkindness of Ghosts have very simple motivations, but they're just so mundane and self centered and despicable that I was like really riled up. I really did not like the villains. And I just thought that Solomon did a great job writing these people that I hated. And here I felt like kind of detached from the villains, which was weird because they do some pretty despicable things. They violate Vern's trust and Vern's boundaries and Vern's autonomy. I don't really know what Solomon could have done differently to get me like more engaged with the villains, but it felt like something was missing. I thought there's a lot of interesting ideas in this book. I thought there are things I really loved. Like I really loved the characters. I really loved the writing in the first half. But when it ended, like I wanted more of an emotional resolution. I didn't really feel like there's anything necessarily wrong with any of the plot points that happened. I just kind of wanted it to be handled maybe a little differently so I could walk away feeling like more of an emotional takeaway. I was also very interested in this book in terms of how it relates to Solomon's other writings. So pretty much any time Solomon has written something long form, Faye have written intersex, queer, and disabled or neurodivergent protagonists. I don't see it talked about a lot by critics or readers because I don't know if a lot of people know what it means to be intersex. I'll include like a link from Planned Parenthood explaining in the description box below. But that's been something that Faye have done consistently. Esther from An Unkindness of Ghosts was intersex, like gender queer and autistic. Yetu from The Deep was intersex. There it was a little different because the mer people are like a separate species, and basically every one of the mer people have the same set of sexual organs. Yetu was sapphic and had a sensory processing disorder. And here I mentioned earlier that Vern is intersex, she's sapphic, she is albino and has like low vision as well. And I just think that's noteworthy because like it's a thing that Solomon has been doing consistently. It's also a thing that I don't see a lot of authors doing. Like outside of River Solomon's books, I don't know what authors are really writing intersex protagonists that frequently or disabled protagonists that frequently, let alone like multiple combinations of these identities. Solomon has also written a little bit about like non-penetrative sex. I was thinking specifically about like the progression of sex scenes. The Deep is kind of exempt, like Yetu explains to humans like what sexuality for the mer people looks like, but she doesn't really have sex with anyone. It's not a thing that she has experienced or really talked about. It's more so in An Unkindness of Ghosts, where Aster decides that she wants to like have a sexual experience with someone. She sets boundaries around what she doesn't want to do, and one of those boundaries is that she does not want to be penetrated. And that sex scene was a fade to black, but there was like a lot of tenderness there. In this book, there is still this like emphasis on non-penetrative sex, and there's a particular scene that's sticking out in my head where in one of the hauntings that Vern's observing, she sees two men who are dying of AIDS who are having like sex, and they kind of involve her somehow, even though they're hauntings. And then she relays this experience to Gogo, and then they have an encounter about that. And there's something about like the voyeurism that really drew my attention, and also just the way that the sex scene was written was just very different from what I'm used to. I don't know if I'd really characterize it as a tender scene like in An Unkindness of Ghosts, and I don't know if I'd really even describe it as steamy, even though it is very like explicit. There's something about the language that's very like precise and anatomical, describing like what Vern is doing and what the men are doing. And like because it involves these ghosts who are like dying a very tragic death, there's something about it that isn't like really sensual to me. I don't really know what to make of it, but it was just something that really stood out to me. Another theme that Solomon's written about in other places is single parenting. Aster in An Unkindness of Ghosts was raised by a single parent. On the ship that she calls home, The decks for like the black residents are all gender segregated, which doesn't mean a whole lot because they all have different like rituals around gender and like pronouns being used. And because in An Unkindness of Ghosts it is discussing chattel slavery, the black residents of the ship are kind of just like bred, like they're not expected to have a choice in who they're having children with and how they're parenting and who they're parenting with. So she was only ever really going to be raised by her mom. Her mom commits suicide, and then she's raised by Aunt Melusine, who's kind of like a community aunt. And then in the deep, basically mer people sex is just a giant orgy, and the people kind of go and split their separate ways, and they don't really talk to each other after that. So I think it is also common there for a mer child to be raised by one parent. And Yetu has kind of a unconventional relationship with her mother in that Yetu is an adult who, due to her like sensory processing disorder and the role that she's expected to fill for the other mer people, she really can't care for herself and she has to live with her mother. There's kind of a resentment there. Her mother doesn't really understand what Yetu's going through, and also the ways that Yetu is kind of expected to mother and parent this entire community because she is holding everyone's memories. Here we kind of get a change in pace in that we're seeing the perspective of the person doing the parenting. And I've kind of already talked about how this is like a difficult thing for Vern and that she has taught herself to be an emotional fortress growing up in Caneland, and now to be like a good mother, she kind of has to be better at being nurturing and like being open and paying attention to these young children who she feels very conflicted about having in the first place. And also how her like issues with authority kind of make mothering difficult for her. She takes less of an authoritative approach in some ways, and also children being authoritative kind of make her hackles rise. Like there's a scene where one of her kids, either Howling or Farrell, is being a bossy 3-year-old, as you know, 3-year-olds are wont to do. And it's just to remind herself that like the bossiness and authority that her child is speaking with isn't like a threat to her. Another theme that Solomon writes about kind of frequently that appears here is community as a place of healing and also as a potential threat to the individual. And we see this a little bit in Unkindness of Ghosts. There's a communal effort to help Aster find her mom and like get to safety. And also like there are some people who like picked on her and bullied her, and there are certain norms that like aren't good for Aster. I think it's a lot more explicit and a lot more central in the deep, with Yetu having to take on this like psychic weight to care for the community because of her role as the historian and how it is driving her to depression, it is making her suicidal, and also how like the community changing or trying to reconfigure itself around her allows that to kind of come to an end. And we see that here as well with Vern's encounters with Caneland in terms of Vern's encounters with these hauntings. I don't want to say too much about what causes the hauntings, but I will say that part of the hauntings is related to her time in Caneland and is also part of her being like a single piece in a collective. There are times where the hauntings have brought her senses of peace and an ability to communicate with people, and there's also ways that cause her a lot of physical harm, for one, frighten her, are kind of like a manifestation of her internal guilt and anxieties. And the final thing that Solomon kind of always writes about is the rebellion against the status quo. I think it's pretty straightforward. I won't really get into it here. So that was my review of Sorrowland. There's a lot of things that I liked about it. I thought the writing was really strong for the first half of the book. I really enjoyed the characterization. There's a lot of things that I'm like thinking about from the story, especially in relationship to Solomon's other like long form work. But I did want more from the ending. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. I'm definitely interested if you plan on reading it. If you've read it already, what are your thoughts? So I've been looking at other reviews, and it seems like, I don't know if there's really a whole lot of people in the same camp as me. It seems like people either really like the book, they don't like it, but also based on their review, I don't know if they really understand it or Solomon's politic. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Goodbye.